Hello and welcome to Say Hi to the Future, a podcast aimed at highlighting the human side of ingenuity. My name is Ken Tenser, CEO of SpyderWorks, a leading business consultancy for mid-market organizations and entrepreneurs globally. With me today is Leah Lawrence, President and CEO of Sustainable Development Technology Canada, an organization that funds Canadian Cleantech projects and coaches the companies that lead them as they move their groundbreaking technologies to market. Like this video if you enjoy our show and subscribe to our channel. Leave us a comment with who we should interview next. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the show. Leah Lawrence, welcome to Say Hi to the Future.
It's great to see you, Ken.
So many people say that they fell into clean tech. There's so many people that I meet at least. But you were self-admittedly ESG and intangible asset aware before it was cool. What does that even mean?
What does that mean? Well, you have me there. I mean, someone asked me, as you just did, when did you get started and all this stuff? And I had to say I have no idea, and I guess I just can't help myself. Mm-hmm. For many years now, for over a decade, maybe even three, two of the biggest megatrends have been climate change and digitization. And in many ways, they're just fascinating to me. And so that's how it all got started. Way back, like in ancient history, when I was studying engineering, I started looking at solar panel and remote locations, and then that takes you quickly to climate change. And then with my first job with a large energy company in Western Canada, I got to be a part of a group that did some of the first emissions trades in the world. And this is like mid-90s, before the Kyoto Protocol is even signed, with a group of people who really thought, well, you could bring together some smart folks and do the legal and scientific frameworks and get a market going where one at that time didn't even exist. And from that experience, you bridge to environmental markets and then entrepreneurship. So how do entrepreneurs get into new markets, create them, build them, successful companies out of what prior people hadn't recognized to be something interesting? I know something you talk about all the time with folks on your podcast, and that's what's so fun about it. After that, I founded a few companies, always with a sustainability angle, and just kept going from there. And so it was sort of a logical next step, maybe, that I would become the president and CEO of Sustainable Development Tech Canada, where we work with hundreds of entrepreneurs every year to develop their sustainability tech, their businesses, and try to help grow them to scale. And so I think that's what, the ESG thing comes around more recently, right. But the climate tech stuff has been a long-standing thing, sustainability tech as well. And then intangibles. Well, one of my favorite things is the overlap of digitization and climate. And how does that happen? If we go back to some of the early days when we were trying to do those emissions trades, you didn't have data that you needed. You didn't have it in real time for sure. And so, in fact, most of what you had to do in business transactions, but also in regulatory systems, when you're looking at these areas of climate and environment, is you have to do things by proxy. You have to get an estimate. It's a second best estimate, or whatever they call that in economics. It's been so long since I read that stuff. But and so you're always trying to do an approximation. But these days, that's not what's happening at all, and that gets really exciting. And I sort of got an inkling of where it was going to go. I think it was around 2010, and if you recall, there was that, you may not recall, but that year there was the oil spill with the Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf of Mexico. Right. And I remember sitting there, when we still watched TV, watching CNN, and they had this guy who was an expert in satellite imagery, and he said, the company doesn't realize how big the spill really is, and here's how I calculated it, and here's the public data, and blah, blah, blah. And I thought, wow, we're in a point where for a low cost, you're going to have democratization of environmental information, which had never happened before. And so, fast forward, now you have things like Barcelona Smart Cities, where block by block, they're having entrepreneurs, people who are working in local community settings, data rights advocates, privacy advocates, all these things coming together and prioritizing how you could use technology to make a local community have better air quality, have less sound, have all these things. Going to Montreal, you have GHGsat, which is an interesting company here in Canada that is monitoring methane in real time. And so, when we have an emissions release like we did in the North Sea related to the pipeline, we know almost instantly because companies like GHGsat are around. So anyway, all that to say, ESG and intangibles, that's how it comes together, is idea that with better information, lower cost technologies, we can do things that we were never able to do before, and we can do them in every sector. And so how does that happen? And that sort of is squaring the circle where we are at today, at SDTC and what we do.
Well, that's a heck of a journey, and it's wonderful what you're doing now. But how do we get people to truly understand? Because, one, growing up, and I'm going to show my age, even though I'm not, I am on camera. I'll show my age. When I was younger, if we got rid of aerosols, we would save the world. That was it. Apparently, that didn't work. So
well, it did, but then we added a whole bunch more people, and we created new kinds of products, and didn't maybe realize when there was many of them, what would happen, and so you get microplastics in oceans, you get all these kinds of things. So then we have to try to find ways to fix that, or at least address the unintended consequences and get us to a new level of environmental performance.
So how do we foster the foresight? Is that what you're breeding with the entrepreneurs and helping them to understand, or are they coming to you and saying these are the 5 things that we're really worried about?
I think it's a bit of both. In some ways, you have this vast group of people who are really creative and thinking about what could be. And so they ideate all kinds of things and bring new ideas. And so then often we have to work with them and try and figure out, okay, how would we quantify that? Is there a market? Could there be a market? How do we get there? And in some ways, you have to, for a bit, take a leap of faith until you can get a customer. Not forever, because that's not how businesses are built, obviously. So in some ways it's that. In others, actually, we do try to foster. So we'll bring companies together who are maybe working on the edges of things, and if they came together and shared expertise and knowledge, that maybe they could get a better product for a farmer, or they could, get more soil carbon into the ground in that instance, or they could figure out how to, come together to redesign and rethink an electric vehicle so that it is even better and has better range and all these things 10 years from now than it might be envisioned today.
Right.
So we kind of do both, but at the end of the day, what our ethos and our mandate is stuff has to have an environmental and economic benefit that can be quantified, is substantial and material, and you can build a business off of it. Right. And that's really the essence. Yeah.
Well, and I think that last point too, especially with entrepreneurs, and I'm familiar with being an entrepreneur, making it accessible. And what I mean is, we look at electric vehicles, we look at electric school buses, we look at, in the U.S., there's a lot of grants for going electric, but there's also stories, where weather doesn't permit, where it's minus 20, where they've moved over to electric buses and they just can't drive the routes in the winter. And they're, so what is that balance like? I'm sure in all businesses that we need to make a profit, we need to hit a target market, and it has to be an accessible one.
Yeah, I think it's a great question in that it's a near-term, long-term essence. And you have to remember, I live in the land of optimism for 10 years from now. Most of our companies go commercial and profitable about, actually, our data shows about 12 to 15 years after inception, usually about 5 or 8 years after we've met them. So we're really at an early stage of a company's journey. But let's take your example of electric buses in cold weather. Now, this is an area where Canada should excel. So, different chemistries will be needed over time to be able to adapt to different local conditions. And we have companies here in Canada that are working on that. And if we're looking for an area maybe where Canada could have a comparative advantage, maybe in partnership with some other Scandinavian entrepreneurs, this would be it. So you may have read, in fact, I think they're not too far from here, there's a group called Avro who brought together 50 entrepreneurs in automotive manufacturing. These are some of the problems they're trying to tackle, not just cold weather for Canadian markets or for cold weather markets, but how do you rethink the automobile from the ground up, recognizing that in early days it might not work as well as we all wanted it to, but we have to, walk before we can run, try stuff out. And it's sort of it's sort of a cost ambition trade-off. How far can we go, and how far will the customer willing to go today and pay us for that, because we need that, and then maybe it's 3 to 5 years from now that we really get long range on cold weather batteries. So,
well, and I love the fact that you're talking about sharing with other countries what they're doing, not just in the development, but I'm thinking of business as well to understand the application, because one of our earlier guests, Team Polar, it's out of Eindhoven. They're a student group, and actually the Technical University in Eindhoven has some of the coolest students that I've ever spoken to in my life. So they've created and they've tested in the Antarctic. It's basically a solar probe that does the research. But what was really cool was because most of the light is refracted off of the ice, the panels are below and on the side. And when I was listening to that, I'm going, boy, more people need to know that, because we just think of our roofs. But look, hey, even in the winter here, refraction off of ice, off of other parts of the world, I think it's just got to. I just think these are things that people need to know and share more readily.
I think so. And what you're not knowing this company, but the ideas are fantastic, is that you're really talking about what's an innovation spectrum, right?
Yeah.
So today, what's commercial and commodified? Solar panels on our roofs, relatively low cost. That's actually 20 to 30 years of innovation, as you and I both know, because we were there, remember the beginning of it probably. And so now we're getting into, how do you take those materials, modify them slightly, and take them in an entirely new way to get what is more diffuse light, which is what you're talking about, but making it such that you can create electricity and do it eventually in a profitable way. So I love that. Like, that is the arc of innovation. You start out, you do what you can, and then you continuously build. I don't know. Have you had Dan Bresnitz on your podcast? If you haven't, you should. He's a guy at the Monk School here at U of T. And his book's called Innovation in Real Places, and he talks about 4 stages of innovation, right? And so what you're talking about, if we go back to where solar panels started, at the time it was novel technology, right? What you're talking about now with these students perhaps is what he would call stage 3, which is, now you're thinking about how you take what is pre-existing suites of technology and take it to the next level.
Right.
To use something much more mundane, it's kind of like the iPhone, the first iPhone and the one you have today, just the different capacity, the different technologies. So, whereas it may have had 50 technologies when it started, now it's got 400 integrated into it, and you've been able to evolve it into something that never would have been profitable, acceptable, easily usable, all those things in the first year. Now you can. And this is the same kind of thing you're talking about, I think, with solar panel and solar energy.
And I think the same sort of story has to be told for the businesses themselves. I mean, to date, it's always been an expense versus an investment. And I think that as we start to understand business operations and the impact on business operations, the impact on the public and your brand, I think it's really changing quickly. It's becoming a necessity. But is that something that businesses are equipped to do? And I don't mean the Fortune 500. I mean the everyday. Well, there's 300 million mid-sized and small companies in the world. So
I always say, like families, I think businesses have a spectrum of folks that are involved in them. And so, but let's take one that we might think is more quote unquote mundane and not in the clean tech space. And let's take fashion. Okay. Actually, a huge movement right now is environment and fashion, and that is the consumers who are looking to consume clothing are also requiring that it be reported what the life cycle emissions impacts are. They're looking for alternatives in terms of rental of certain clothing. So you're starting to see new business models. You're starting to see different approaches, and why? Being driven by consumers who are demanding environmental approaches to clothing. So you might have not thought clothing was clean tech, but you know what? Clothing is clean tech.
It is,
and it's such an interesting thing. And so now you go to the spectrum. It is true that in some businesses, standards, codes, requirement, it's like a status quo business operating expense. It's true, especially in large industrial sort of applications. But, where you have a direct B2C kind of relationship, I think you're starting to see more push in that area. Now, also investment. It depends if you're bootstrapping or if the company needs capital, right? So there are funds dedicated now and growing for sustainable kinds of things, impact investing, all these things. In fact, right now, as we know, there's sort of a bit of a pullback on tech investment. We're not actually seeing that at all in climate tech investment right now. The last 2 years have been record for our portfolio and globally on venture and angel investing and now transitioning into growth capital. And so far this year, we're seeing the same thing. So will that change? Obviously could. But for now, this is a long-term trend that is continuing and is not reverting back.
Leah, your passion seems to come from funding and from coaching. What makes you so passionate about those two areas, and how does that work in your daily life?
Well, I don't know if I'd call it so much coaching with our companies, but I have been an entrepreneur for better or for worse in some of my examples. I think the biggest thing is that when I talk to a CEO, when I talk to some folks in companies, I've been there, right? So I know what it's like. I know what it's like to try and raise money. I know what it's like to pay yourself last. I know all the things you know. I know what it's like to bootstrap. I'm going to
start getting a tick here.
Yeah. I know what it's like to pay yourself last. I remember this one time my accountant said to me, I said to my accountant, every morning I walk my dog at 6 a.m. and I keep thinking, okay, receivables, payables, la la la. She goes, "Oh, you're doing cash flow management." I went, "Oh, really? I thought it was just stress." But anyway, I guess I had a word for it. I didn't realize. But anyway, long story made short, I always have time for a CEO or anybody in a company when they call me, because I know that there are lots of people who are naysayers in an entrepreneur's life. Right? It's a tough way to go. There's lots of dead ends, and you really have to be a positive human being to overcome the challenges. I mean, as I said, 12 to 15 years. That's a long time to have perseverance and to pivot your business model and all those kinds of things. So that's really something I think about. When I first started this job, my chair was a guy named Jim Balsillie, who people will know, and he and I talked a lot at the time. And in fact, I just was on a workshop with him this week about we really get frustrated when people say Canadian entrepreneurs, it's not a culture, there's no fire in the belly, blah blah blah. That's not it at all. It's that we have a network that needs to be nurtured and grown, and it needs to be connected to people who have learned how to raise lots of money and scale up companies. And we just have fewer of those in Canada than we might have in the United States and other places. That doesn't mean they're not here. It just means that perhaps if you live in St. John's or Victoria or someplace in between, you might not have met those people yet, right? So what can we do about that? How can we connect? So this is on the company's side. I think sometimes it's Schadenfreude. I think sometimes, one of our CEOs said to me, "Oh, Leah, thank God we used to talk on Friday afternoons all the time." He said, "Leah, talking to you is just like therapy." And I said, "Well, I'm not registered, but okay." And anyway, but sometimes I see, as you know, being a CEO is a tough place. You're making all these trade-off decisions, and there's not a lot of people who've been in that space. So anyway, I just try to be there sometimes on Friday afternoon. For our team, it's similar. We really have changed the culture and the ethos, I think, over the 8 years I've been there, because and if you read our corporate plan today, you'll see our North Star is it's about the companies. And that might sound like it should be, but if, for an innovation funder that receives its money from a government, sometimes that isn't necessarily front and center. And so over time, we always, in fact, I had this written on, it's about the companies on my whiteboard for years. And so whenever we got in a place where we had to think about, well, what's the priority of this way of doing business? How should we be thinking about our funding streams? Should we evolve them? It always got back to, well, what do the companies need? And how do we know? And what's the data to back that up? And can we do that? And, sometimes you can't because, everybody has rules from their financiers. But sometimes you can. And so it's about starting from a position of yes and then seeing what happens. So, coaching, sure. It's about how do you see the world differently, and how do you see it through the eyes of some people who are trying to change it, and then what do you do about it? So,
well, I do think one of the challenging things about Canada, and look, I know we've got great entrepreneurs and a growing entrepreneurial ecosystem, but I went to New York for my publisher and my publicist for my books, and I'll do that for my third one. Our success in the U.S. with Say Hi has driven our work here. There's a credibility factor, and I think Canadians have got to give their head a shake and say, no, if it works here, it's credible too. And that's a challenge that entrepreneurs face, I think, across the board.
Yeah, well, I do think there are structural issues in the markets that we have in Canada that need to be overcome. I'm not sure about publishing. This isn't an area I know very far. But what I do know is we have a large concentration of big companies. They do very well. We have very few mid-sized companies. And in fact, we have lost most of our mid-sized financing capability in private equity and banks and all those kinds of things, which is one of the reasons our entrepreneurs have to go to the United States to get money. Sometimes we just may not have skills and expertise or confidence in certain areas. Maybe publishing is one of them. I don't know, but so in that regard, and back to, I'm going to be talking about Dan's book again, by the book, I guess. But anyway, he really talks about that we need a 10 or 20, maybe even a 30-year vision to think about what are we good at and how do we build it out, and how do we make sure that we have a domestic market that's vibrant as well as an export market that's vibrant. And so I think that's the key thing is through the ecosystem and evolution of innovation, which is changing rapidly, as you would know, podcasts, print books, all these things. Through the evolution of innovation, where do we have a place we can win, and how do we get there? And and who are the talented people that will help us get there? So I don't know the publishing realm, but I hope you do, and I hope you're talking to them all the time about that question of how do we create the connective tissue? Where there's barriers, how do we break them down? And then how do we spread the word that this is possible, in Canada, in the cases where we should prioritize, and what are we going to do about it? Like that's the fun part. So thank you for doing that.
Oh, it is. Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, it is a challenge. Even in my manufacturing days, I mean, very early, I was in my 20s, which was a long time ago, doing natural bath and body care. Maybe not up to today's standards, but certainly far ahead of the market then. And again, credibility came from the American market for us. So I am rooting for Canada.
Well, it's a hard row to hoe, as they say, because here's the thing. Our productivity statistics, if you look back, have been declining for 30 years. Our business investment in R&D declining for 30 years. So what does that mean? We actually don't know what it's like to grow those things, because 30 years is a long time in a business life, right? So I think we have to rethink some things.
Yes.
And learn some things maybe train some muscles that we haven't trained in a long, long time. And of course, the world is much different than it was 30 years ago. So, we really have to think about how we're going to do that in a different way than we've ever done it before. And we're going to.
Yes, we do.
And we are.
So, Leah, as our time comes to a close here on Say Hi to the Future, closing question. Who are some of the sustainability change makers? Who should we be keeping an eye on? Companies, individuals that are helping to do for Canada and for the world what we've just been discussing. I
couldn't agree more. It's such a great bridge. So a couple of years ago, we started talking about asking the question, can you name a Canadian Cleantech success story? And this is quite a few years ago now, and the answer was kind of frustratingly no, right? And so we started to think about, okay, well, if we were going, so first of all, we have the privilege of working with folks who are trying and aspiring to do that. So we have more data and information than most people would have in Canada on this kind of thing. So we started thinking about, okay, well, if we were going to say somebody was a sustainability change maker, what would be the data we'd use? What would be the criteria? And so we last year got the courage to do the first Made in Canada list. The criteria are quite rigorous. You have to have steady annual revenues of over 10 million annually. You have to have a compound growth rate of 20% or more over the last 3 years. You have to have a global footprint. You have to Canadian presence with 50% of your workforce and significant operations in Canada. And you have to be, because we're Sustainable Development Technology Canada, delivering significant environmental benefits as measured by the proprietary measures that we have internally. So for the first time last year, we celebrated, and we're going to do another 10 this May. 10 companies in Canada are doing that. Two of them, one is here in Mississauga, Vive Crop Protection. So they're looking at different ways of thinking about chemistry to help farmers increase crop yields through less and better approaches to fungicides, insecticides, herbicides, those kinds of things. Another one not too far down the road in Collingwood is KDH. They, for a long time, Stewart Energy prior, had been doing deuterium, there's a good word, and hydrogen industry technologies. And right now they're expanding and trying to break into the large-scale energy storage market. So interesting companies there. There's another one in Vancouver who I love. It's called Semios Bio. They started out 15 years ago now using pheromones, so different than Vive Crop, but using pheromones in orchards to try and get bugs to go have sex somewhere else. And now they've got this whole farming business that is in, I can't remember. It's in like 4 continents and hundreds of thousands of acres doing all kinds of stuff.
How are you measuring success of getting bugs to have sex elsewhere?
Well, that's not the measure. The measure is that you don't have to use insecticides and pesticides, and you're allowing the diverse ecosystem of insects, which we need, to still function and do the important things it does, just not on your high-value almond trees or lemon trees or whatever the case may be. Anyway, we're getting off track there, I think.
Sorry, it was just, I've never heard that one before. So
I'm just quoting the CEO there. He came up with that line, not me, but it gets to the point, so it's good.
Okay. Well, thank you for those examples, Leah, and I hope that we have many, many more in Canada, and Canada's footprint expands to the world. So Leah Lawrence, SDTC, you're the president and CEO. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It was my pleasure. What a fun conversation.
Thank you.